We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Holyrood, the podcast where each week we chew over the latest news in Scottish politics. And joining me today for another edition are two distinguished colleagues from the world of Scottish journalism. We have John Ferguson, the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Ben Borland, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. Now, today's episode is being recorded exactly 1 year to the day the voters will go to the polls at next year's Holyrood elections. And I'm sure the listeners will be every bit as excited about that as we are here in the studio. Now, to mark this momentous occasion, John Swinney and Sarwar were both out this morning giving speeches on why they should be the next First Minister of Scotland. So we'll turn to the Scottish Labour leader first. So Anas Sarwar was speaking at Pollokshields Borough Hall in the south side of Glasgow, an event that I went along to cover for the Daily Record. And amongst the points that Anas mentioned was how keen John Swinney has been recently to talk about Nigel Farage and the prospect of reforms, advancement, and whether or not Nigel Farage could become the next Prime Minister. Now, Anas Sarwar said that Farage is, quote, a bogeyman, a convenient figure for John Swinney to talk about rather than his own domestic record in government. And I believe that we can see a clip of Anas speaking about that just now.
Now, we already know what John Swinney wants to make this election about. He wants to make it all about the new bogeyman, Nigel Farage, and use that chancer as an excuse to talk about everything but the SNP's record in government. And with his record of failure, it's no wonder. He's the man that broke the NHS, so it's no wonder he doesn't want to talk about our health service. He's the man that oversaw the falling standards in our schools and marked down the exam results of working class kids during the pandemic, so it's no surprise he doesn't want to talk about that either. He's the man that exported jobs and opportunities overseas while Scottish communities lost out. But instead of dealing with his own failures, John Swinney will recklessly talk up Farage. Nigel Farage is John Swinney's new cover to replace the Tories. But the truth is, I don't care about Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage doesn't care about Scotland.
Now, before we talk about the points raised by Anas Sarwar there, we should mention that just a short time before we began recording this episode, that a new poll, now obviously we love a poll on Planet Holyrood, a new poll came out saying that Reform UK could overtake Scottish Labour at next year's Holyrood election. Now, just briefly, this survey by True North found that the SNP, as other polls have suggested, would emerge comfortably as the largest party in next year's election. They'd be on 58 MSPs. But Reform could end up in second with 21, with Labour left languishing on just 18. Now, this poll came out after Anas Sarwar had been speaking this morning, John, but let's just jump back to what he said about Nigel Farage being a bogeyman conveniently for John Swinney. Is there much truth in that? Is that a fair comment?
I mean, I think it's probably a true statement to make, as much as Anas would like to couch it in terms of something that John Swinney's tried to use to his advantage. One of Anas's big messages has been that really strip everything away. This is a battle between the SNP and Labour that's looking like it's just not the case anymore. Actually, this could be a battle between SNP and Reform, with the Reform Party splitting the unionist vote in all sorts of ways, which is bad for Labour, it's bad for the Tories. I think that what this poll really shows is that things are going to be very, very difficult for all of the established parties going forward. Labour's pitch to voters has been that, times are tough, knuckle down, be stoic, and maybe, things can only get worse, but maybe they'll get better in the future if you do all the right things. Reform are going to be coming in saying we can transform your lives. It's going to be easy. We're going to do it by wiping away all of these green policies. We're going to do it by cracking down on immigration, and that's the things that they'll actually do. The other things that they'll be talking about are things like nationalising industries and all the rest of it. It makes that message that Labour have set up for themselves very difficult to maintain over the next year if they want to turn this poll around.
Ben, is it not the case, though, that sure, John Swinney is talking a lot about Nigel Farage, maybe because it means he's not to talk about the SNP's record in government. But on the flip side, Labour don't want to talk about Keir Starmer, the UK government's record in the government. They want to talk about anything but Keir Starmer and the UK government. So, I mean, how do Labour square that home?
I mean, it's a hard one for Labour. I personally, and I keep saying this, I personally think Keir Starmer is improving. I think he's been on an upward trajectory ever since, paradoxically, ever since Trump got in. I think the Labour UK government's looked a lot better. I think we've got another budget coming that could, by this time next year, Labour voters in Scotland could be a lot more comfortable with a UK Labour government. Labour front-loaded their 5 years in power at Westminster with all the bad stuff in the first 12 months. They're going to hope that, because they've got Wales as well, they've got the Welsh and Scottish elections next year. Labour are desperate to hold on to power in Wales. They're absolutely desperate to return to power in Scotland. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how important that is at a UK level for Labour. Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's main strategist, he's Irish, but he lives in Scotland. His wife's a Scottish Labour MP. Scotland is huge. I genuinely think they have taken this into account, and they are going to be trying to. At the moment, Keir Starmer's not a good thing for Anna Sarwar to talk about. Who knows, by next April that could be different.
So you expect there could be some rabbits pulled from hats?
Absolutely, yeah, I think so.
Now and the election?
I think there's been rabbits pulled from hats already. I think Scunthorpe, obviously the English council elections were huge for reform. I don't think they were as bad for Labour as many were expecting. I think the measures taken to save the steelworks at Scunthorpe probably impressed a lot of Red Wall voters. I think Starmer's role on the world stage has kind of impressed middle of the road voters. The India trade deal, I don't know. I know there's some concern about the fact that Indian employees, that there's some tax breaks that UK citizens don't get. On the other hand, it's huge for Scotch whisky. This is arguably the India trade deal should have been what Anna Sarwar was talking about this morning. Yeah, it's enormous. It's colossal for Scotch whisky. So I think that this disconnect between UK and Scottish Labour will come together. Now, whether that'll be enough to stop the SNP returning as the largest party, it may have been before suddenly we got this curveball thrown in from reform, which, same as at Westminster, people are saying the two-party era's over. Westminster's going to have to get used to multi-party politics. We're already used to that in Scotland, but we've now got another major player in the mix. And, it's how does that work out?
Yeah. John, just on Anna Sarwar, do you feel that his message is getting through to Scots? Is he getting a fair hearing, or is there a risk that he's just being drowned out by the news coming out from Westminster on a daily basis?
It's really difficult for Anas because, on one hand, there'll be a lot of pressure, and he has done that. Not so much recently, but over the last year, he has, on specific issues, decided to distance himself from Westminster, but it's really like you lose either way, don't you? If he distances himself from Westminster, he makes it look like that's the story is about division and infighting. If he goes along with some of these unpopular policies, then the story is that he's not sticking up for Scotland. I thought it was interesting what you said, Ben, about just how important to the Labour Party Scotland is. I think that's true, but I would say there's a question mark about how important winning a Holyrood election is for Labour. I think they're very concerned about winning seats at the next Westminster election, but I suspect they would be willing to sacrifice some seats in a Holyrood election if it meant sticking with the programme down south. And it's been interesting that yes, they front-loaded a lot of the pain, and it does now look as if it's not just, this was part of a strategy and they're now kind of trying to deliver some good news. It does look like they're potentially going to U-turn in some of those early difficult decisions. For example, winter fuel payment. This makes you think back to the last Tory government, which, there was a fresh U-turn every other day, and that also can play badly with voters.
I take your point, Holyrood, they're not going to lose anything because they're not, if Scottish Labour aren't in power next year, it doesn't change anything for Starmer. I think he'd love to have a Scottish Labour government, though.
Ben, just before we move on Labour and the challenge they face for reform, what can Labour do, or should they do anything? Should they stick to their message and try to ignore Nigel Farage, or should they be specifically going after Scots who they think are being tempted by reform?
I'll just not to just make the point that Russell Findlay's also making a speech today. I think in Edinburgh, marking a year to go. Yep. I think Alex Cole-Hamilton is as well, possibly later on. So for me, the bigger threat from reform is the Conservatives. I mean, they have had for nearly a decade now. They've been the second party at Holyrood. They've been the official opposition. This poll suggests that they're going to go into fourth place. So it's obviously we sort of pitch Sarwar v Swinney as First Minister, but the real challenge here is how does Russell Findlay see off reform? And the other thing is, if reform are going to consolidate their place as the second biggest party, they don't have a Scottish leader. This is a party that's in second place in the polls. Who would be First Minister under reform?
I think I'm sure it's been mentioned in this podcast a few times, but I think reform in Scotland do have the advantage, weirdly, of not having a leader and no Scottish policy platform, because they don't have to defend it. They don't have to speak about it. They can pretty much stand back and let the other parties do the talking for them. We will come on to talk about the Conservatives and other parties at the end of the podcast, because, as you say, the Scottish Conservatives and the Conservatives across the UK in general facing enormous pressure at the moment. From now, I want to talk a bit about John Swinney, who also gave a speech today. He was speaking in Edinburgh. He was joined on stage by the SNP's slew of candidates for the Holyrood election next year. And as Anas Sauer predicted, he did have a lot to say about Nigel Farage in a clip that I think we can now see.
Friends, if you want to know what happens when governments don't deliver for the people, look no further than last week's local election results south of the border. An ill wind of change is blowing through UK politics, and after last week, it is no longer fanciful and deeply regrettable to suggest that Nigel Farage could be the Prime Minister in a few years' time. This should be a wake-up call for people across Scotland, but certainly not a surprise. Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have opened the door to Farage because they have failed to stand up to, dancing to Farage's tune on immigration, too scared to admit that Brexit has been a disaster, alienating communities in England by maintaining Tory austerity cuts. That's what you get with Labour. At Westminster, Nigel Farage may not be in office, but he's very much in power. You don't beat populists by imitating them. You beat them by confronting them. We will never do any deals with Farage. Only the SNP will confront Farage and defeat Farage.
Okay, so John Swinney speaking about his favoured subject, according to Sarwar anyway, Nigel Farage there. John, is reform, is this like the best possible gift the SNP could have been given in this stage in the electoral cycle?
There is definitely an argument that that is the case, isn't there? That this new party, which on the face of it should be fairly unpopular in Scotland, they come in, they destroy the Tories, they split the Labour vote, they hand the SNP Holyrood election, they potentially then go on to win a general election in the UK. The dream scenario for John Swinney would be that Nigel Farage is then fairly soft and independent. He doesn't really care. He's an English nationalist at heart, and he says, well, if you want to have another referendum and become independent, fine, off you go. That would be the John Swinney's absolute dream scenario for the next 5-6 years. So yeah, I think it's easy to see why Farage is good for the SNP, but I don't think you should discount the fact that Reform are going to take votes off of the SNP as well. They're in many ways quite comparable parties. They both offer a sort of transformative, dramatic reworking of society and offer to wipe out the political establishment as it is, and offer something which they claim will transform people's lives in fairly easy ways. So there's going to be a lot of SNP voters who are also tempted by Farage. I guess the big question in all of this is just how far can the reform thing go? Are they actually going to become an election winning force, not just in the UK, but in Scotland as well over the next few years?
Ben, just to park reform for a moment, the SNP are the party of government in Scotland. They have been for a long time. They had their programme for government announced on Tuesday. The domestic record of the SNP, is that going to be a problem for them next year?
It should be. It really should be. The programme for government, John Swinney moved it forward from September. I think, I don't know about you guys, I was expecting a lot more. I was expecting some major announcements. He was so keen to get them out there that he's actually brought it forward by 5 months. And it turned out to be, I think, as the Tories described it, quite flimsy. Two of the big policies were, again, just to use Anna Sarwar's words, nicked from Labour.
I think he wants some easy stuff that he can do.
Yeah, easy hits, but there was nothing really. I mean, it's almost like they could have axed drinking on trains a year or two ago, but someone's gone, hang on, let's save this and do it before the election. They could have kept the ban on off-peak fares, but it's like, oh no, bring them back and then we can get rid of them again just before the election. And they were the two big headlines, and 100,000 extra GP appointments. Well, great, but I mean, it's not going to be able to be measured in time for next year's. I just thought it was very flat.
Yeah, I mean, it was great news if, like me, you travel regularly on ScotRail, because the peak time fares, obviously, no one wants to have to spend more on public transport than they already do. But as you say, Ben, it wasn't even a year ago that the Scottish Government were telling us that scrapping peak fares in perpetuity was just not sustainable.
Not sustainable.
But that was before the UK Government helpfully gave them the largest devolution settlement in recorded history, something that the Scottish Government doesn't like to talk about that much, but they do have more money to play with right now, maybe not longer term, but right now they do, and that has helped fund things like the get rid of peak time fares. On the 100,000 GP appointments though, well, obviously anyone who's phoning up their doctor at 8 a.m. and struggling to get an appointment will welcome the idea of more appointments. You should put that into context.
I think I've been 100,000 in the queue phoning at 8 a.m. So I mean,
because just a bit of context here, in January, there were, and this is just in Scotland, there were 2.9 million GP appointments, including that can't be wrong. We'll check that. But this is a drop in the ocean, is the point I'm making here when it comes to GP appointments. And I agree with you, Ben, that I didn't feel there was a whole lot in the programme for government. And certainly by the time voters go to the polls in May next year, I don't think many of them will be thinking back to that statement going, this has been a game changer for me. In terms of the next year, though, John, I mean, is this a case for the SNP government of steady as she goes, don't scare the horses, let's just carry on quietly and as efficiently as we can because, we're on a good thing here, and if we can just avoid any unnecessary pitfalls or home and dry.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is actually kind of what John Swinney's about as a politician as well. I think that he wants to avoid any culture war stuff, anything, to do with gender politics, any of that. He wants to put it behind him. He wants to get a few policies that he knows that he can deliver over the next year, announce them, deliver them, steady the ship, show himself to be a competent leader and the SNP to be a competent party of government again. I reckon he will be thinking that can get us over the line potentially now with the rise of reform, maybe even with a majority administration in Scotland. I think that would be a huge challenge, but I think that is the way he sees the game playing out now.
We did mention other parties apart from the SNP and Labour. Ben, you mentioned the Scottish Conservatives. Without going back to reform, I mean, I know the two things are, inextricably linked, but Russell Findlay is in an extremely difficult position right now, isn't he? We have the Hamilton by-election next month, and realistically, they're going to be fourth at best in that. They could be sub 10% in terms of votes. Is that without them going to face a national result next year?
I don't think they'll be too worried about Hamilton. It's not an area that's traditionally strong for them. I think there was a green shoot for Russell Findlay in John Swinney's speech today. Swinney's obviously feeling more confident. He's obviously feeling a little bit more bullish. And even though he's going to be careful, he's going to try and not make any mistakes, he still needs to win back quite a large percentage of disenfranchised independent supporters who don't think the SNP go far enough on pushing for the breakup of the UK. So I noticed today that he'd said, if we get a pro-independence majority, there will be a referendum in the next. I mean, the Supreme Courts and the UK governments might have their own views on that, but he said there will be an independence referendum. The thing the Tories want more than anything is for Scottish independence to climb back up to the top of the political sort of hit parade at Holyrood. If that's the number one issue, the Tories will clean up, because they are without doubt the strongest party of the union. Like you say, Nigel Farage doesn't seem overly committed one way or the other. Labour have got their own problems because it's not really their area. What the Tories need is for independence to become the big talking point again.
Would it not be easy, though, if that scenario played out, as you suggest, would it not be very easy for a large group of Reform MSPs at Holyrood to suddenly just rebadge themselves as the party of union, rather than a party that people associate with, for example, the union flag? They're very, British patriots is kind of their thing. Would people not trust them with the union?
I think the Tories are trusted with the union. I think that's their number one selling point. When the union's under threat, Scottish voters who don't want to see, they might not be diehard unionists or to whatever term, but they don't want the risk of breaking up the UK. They go for the Tories.
Is it not quite easy to be the party of the union if you're from a Westminster perspective, all you need to do is keep saying no. There's absolutely no evidence that Labour are going to stop.
No, there is that,
no.
but Scottish
The Tories
Labour
are going
haven't
say
managed
no.
to make themselves, that's arguably why Scottish Labour have had such a problem over the last 15 years. It's because they're not seen as
Is that
the
where
main part of the
their
union.
problems emanate from? I mean,
I know
really, they've been pretty. I don't think there's any evidence of them being particularly soft on the union, really.
Especially under Keir Starmer, I would say.
Absolutely stone walls at every time.
I think, historically, like 2014 Labour, and then under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, they were a bit all over the place on the sort when IndyRef 2 was a thing being talked about. John, though, aside from the prospect of independence giving Russell Findlay something to talk about, is there anything he can do in the immediate term to change these fortunes, or are they being dictated to him by other people?
It's very difficult for the Conservatives at the moment. It kind of feels a bit like, post 97 when New Labour swept to power. And I remember back then there was the same kind of talk about, is this the death of the Conservative Party for good? I suspect that it's probably not. I can remember way back then Gordon Brown was asked about this and he said, look, the Conservative Party is one of the strongest political parties that Britain's ever, the strongest political party that Britain's ever produced. They will be back. There's no question. They'll have their ups and downs, but they'll be back. I suspect it will be the same this time. They're going to go through a very difficult period. But I think you would be, I wouldn't want to talk about their complete demise too soon, because they have an incredible resilience in staying power. But it does feel like their fortunes in Scotland and in London are taking a serious hit, and they're not going to be an election-winning force for the next few years in any parliament.
Ben, I know over at the Daily Express, you guys are huge fans of the Scottish Greens. Are we, on current polling, the SNP falling short of a majority, the Greens may be on about 10 SPs, which could, if the two of them joined forces again, could give the fabled pro-independence majority. Yes, is that something that's likely? Is that something that Scottish voters want, you think?
It's I don't know whether a pro-independence majority is likely. I think it'll be close, and it'll be because of the Green. And I think the thing with Scottish voters have got used to the five-party system. And on the pro-independence side, there is now this tradition that if you're from the more sort of left-wing support of the SNP, you vote Green on the list. And you know that even though they might disagree, they're going to support the SNP on virtually everything. So there's this well-established arrangement that the SNP and the Greens go together on the constituency and the regional list. Reform coming in on certainly on the union has blown it all out of the water, because you've now got three big parties to vote for in the constituencies, and I don't. It might take this one election for people to figure out how best to use your votes. I think the other thing is that the more John Swinney says reform are bad, there's an awful lot of people in Scotland who will just do the opposite of whatever an SNP leader, an SNP First Minister says. So he knows exactly what he's doing. The more he says reform bad, the more a lot of people out there will go, well, if he thinks they're bad, they must be exactly what I want. So not only is he talking up reform to drive down support of Labour and the Tories, that also sends a message to SNP voters who are unhappy that actually stay away from reform. I think at one stage it looked as though reform were going to take votes from all the parties. I think it's looking more and more as though they're taking votes from the unionist parties.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground on this episode today, and we've got a lot of time to think about the election, which, as I said, is a year to go from today. It will be here before you know it, but for now, thanks Ben, and thanks John, and thanks for listening, and we'll be back for another episode of Planet Holyrood next week.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.